The Vietnam War, a conflict etched into the fabric of the 20th century. It transcended boundaries, sparking protests and debates. Hear the voices of those who witnessed the brutality and resilience. Understand the war's impact on Vietnam, the US, and the world. To understand the Vietnam War, we must first journey back in time to a Vietnam under the yoke of French colonialism. For decades, the Vietnamese people endured oppression and exploitation, their resources plundered, their voices silenced. The seeds of resistance were sown in this fertile ground of resentment, fueled by a yearning for self-determination. The French Indochina War, which raged from 1946 to 1954, marked a turning point in this struggle. It was a brutal conflict that pitted the French colonial forces against the Viet Minh, a communist-led independence movement determined to liberate their nation. The echoes of this war would reverberate through the decades, laying the groundwork for the larger conflict to come. The pivotal Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 signaled the end of French dominance. The Viet Minh's stunning victory, achieved against seemingly insurmountable odds, sent shockwaves throughout the world. France, once a colonial titan, was forced to relinquish its grip on Indochina, paving the way for a new era in Vietnamese history. However, the dream of a unified and independent Vietnam was short-lived. The Geneva Accords, signed later that year, divided the nation along the 17th parallel, creating a communist North Vietnam and a US-supported South Vietnam. This artificial partition sowed the seeds of discord, setting the stage for a new chapter in the ongoing struggle for Vietnamese independence. Emerging from the crucible of colonialism and war, Ho Chi Minh became a symbol of Vietnamese resistance and aspiration. A charismatic leader and a fervent nationalist, Ho Chi Minh dedicated his life to freeing his people from foreign domination. His ideology, a blend of communism and Vietnamese nationalism, resonated deeply with the masses, galvanizing support for the independence movement. Born Nguyen Sinh Cung in 1890, Ho Chi Minh's life was a testament to his unwavering commitment to Vietnamese independence. He traveled the world embracing socialist ideals and seeking support for his cause. His tireless efforts earned him the admiration of many, both within Vietnam and on the international stage. Ho Chi Minh's vision for Vietnam extended beyond mere liberation. He envisioned a nation free from poverty and injustice, where all citizens could live with dignity and prosperity. His leadership, rooted in a deep understanding of his people and their struggles, made him a formidable force in Vietnamese politics. However, Ho Chi Minh's communist leanings aroused suspicion and fear in the West, particularly in the United States, which was then embroiled in the Cold War with the Soviet Union. This ideological divide would have profound consequences for Vietnam, setting the stage for a conflict that would draw in superpowers and redefine the geopolitical landscape. The Geneva Accords of 1954, intended to bring peace to Vietnam, instead sowed the seeds of a new conflict. The arbitrary division of the country along the 17th parallel created two Vietnams, a communist North led by Ho Chi Minh and a US-supported South led by Ngo Dinh Diem. This partition, intended as a temporary measure, quickly solidified into a stark ideological and geopolitical fault line. Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist, faced a monumental task in the South. He inherited a nation grappling with the legacies of colonialism, riddled with corruption, and deeply divided along religious and political lines. Despite American backing, Diem struggled to consolidate power and win the hearts and minds of his people. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh's government embarked on a program of land redistribution and socialist reforms. While these measures faced challenges and resistance, they resonated with many Vietnamese who had long suffered under colonial exploitation. The North, despite its economic limitations, projected an image of unity and purpose. As the Cold War intensified, Vietnam became a proxy battleground for the competing ideologies of capitalism and communism. The United States, fearing the domino effect of communism spreading throughout Southeast Asia, poured resources and military advisors into South Vietnam, bolstering Diem's regime and setting the stage for a deeper American entanglement in the region. Section 5. The Domino Theory. The spectre of communism haunted American foreign policy throughout the Cold War. The Domino Theory argued that the fall of one nation to communism would trigger the collapse of neighboring states. This theory held significant sway over American policymakers. Vietnam became a focal point of this Cold War anxiety. The US intervened, propping up the South Vietnamese government. The Domino Theory justified American involvement in Vietnam. However, this simplistic view underestimated the resolve of the Vietnamese people. Section 6. Escalation and American involvement. The United States' involvement in Vietnam was a gradual slide into a quagmire. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964 marked a turning point. President Johnson requested a congressional resolution to escalate military action. American troops poured into Vietnam, swelling to hundreds of thousands. Operation Rolling Thunder marked a significant escalation of the conflict. The Vietnam War was unlike any war the United States had fought before. Section 7. The Fog of War. The Vietnam War was fought not only on the battlefields of Southeast Asia, but also in the living rooms of America. The conflict, brought into homes through the immediacy of television, ignited a firestorm of debate and dissent, polarizing American society and challenging the very foundations of its political and social order. The horrors of war, beamed directly into living rooms across the nation, shattered the illusion of a righteous and winnable conflict. Images of body bags draped in American flags, napalm strikes engulfing villages, and young protesters confronting armed soldiers became seared into the national consciousness. The anti-war movement, fueled by a growing awareness of the war's brutality and the seeming futility of American involvement, gained momentum. College campuses became hotbeds of protest, as students organized teach-ins, demonstrations, and draft card burnings. Musicians like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez provided the soundtrack for a generation's discontent, their lyrics capturing the angst, anger, and disillusionment of an era. The Vietnam War, once a distant conflict, became deeply personal for millions of Americans. It tore at the fabric of families, divided communities, and eroded trust in the government. The war's impact on American society was profound and enduring, leaving behind a legacy of skepticism towards foreign interventions, a questioning of authority, and a deep-seated desire for peace. Section 8. A generation defined. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on a generation, both in the United States and in Vietnam. For those who fought in the jungles and rice paddies, the war was a crucible of fire, forging bonds of brotherhood and leaving behind scars, both visible and invisible. The American soldiers who served in Vietnam, many of them young draftees, faced unimaginable horrors. They endured grueling jungle warfare, witnessed unspeakable atrocities, and grappled with the moral complexities of a conflict that seemed to defy easy answers. The war left an indelible mark on their psyches, shaping their worldviews and their relationships for decades to come. For the Vietnamese people, both North and South, the war was a cataclysmic event that forever altered the course of their nation's history. They endured years of bombing, displacement, and unimaginable loss. Families were torn apart, villages razed, and the land scarred by Agent Orange, a toxic herbicide used by the US military. The Vietnam War was a generations war, a conflict that tested the limits of human endurance and left an enduring legacy of pain, loss, and resilience. It is a story that demands to be told, not just to understand the past, but to learn from it and to honor the sacrifices of all those who were touched by its long shadow. Section 1. Seeds of Discord, 1955 to 1959. The Geneva Accords promised a temporary division of Vietnam, followed by elections. But Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by the US, refused elections. He ruthlessly suppressed opposition, targeting communists. Ho Chi Minh watched with concern, consolidating his power. The seeds of discord began to sprout. The North aided the Viet Cong insurgency in the South. A new chapter in the Vietnam War was about to begin. Section 2. The rise of the Viet Cong, 1960 to 1963. In the rural villages of South Vietnam, a new force was emerging, the Viet Cong. Composed of guerrillas opposing Diem's regime, the Viet Cong fought a guerrilla war. Supported by the North Vietnamese army, they used stealth, sabotage, and terror. They blended with the local population, disappearing into jungles and tunnels. They ambushed patrols and targeted government officials. Diem's persecution of Buddhists swelled their ranks. They promised land reform and an end to foreign interference. Their message resonated, especially in rural areas. The rise of the Viet Cong challenged the South Vietnamese government and its American backers. Section 3. A President's Dilemma, from 1961 to 1963. Across the world in Washington, D.C., young President John F. Kennedy faced a growing crisis in Southeast Asia. The situation in Vietnam was deteriorating, and the Domino Theory weighed heavily on his mind. The prospect of a communist victory in Vietnam and its potential ripple effects throughout the region was unacceptable. Kennedy, a staunch Cold Warrior, was committed to containing the spread of communism. But he was also wary of being drawn into a full-scale war in Vietnam. He had seen the French struggle and fail, and he feared that America could become bogged down in a protracted and unwinnable conflict. Kennedy opted for a middle ground, increasing military aid to South Vietnam, sending advisors and trainers, and authorizing the use of defoliants like Agent Orange to deny the Viet Cong cover. He believed that the United States could help the South Vietnamese help themselves, providing support without direct combat involvement. However, the situation on the ground continued to worsen. The South Vietnamese army, despite American training and equipment, struggled to combat the Viet Cong. Diem's regime, increasingly authoritarian and corrupt, seemed unable or unwilling to enact the reforms necessary to win the support of the people. Kennedy found himself caught in a dilemma: withdraw and risk the fall of South Vietnam, or escalate American involvement with no guarantee of success. Section 4. Ghosts of Dien Bien Phu, 1963. The year 1963 marked a turning point in the Vietnam War, a year where the ghosts of Dien Bien Phu loomed large. In August, a group of South Vietnamese generals with tacit American approval staged a coup d'etat against Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, were captured and assassinated. The coup, while ostensibly aimed at removing a corrupt and unpopular leader, plunged South Vietnam into further chaos. A succession of military governments struggled to fill the power vacuum, each more unstable and ineffective than the last. The assassination of Diem, far from stabilizing the situation, only served to exacerbate the existing political turmoil. For the Viet Cong, the coup was a propaganda victory. They exploited the instability in Saigon, intensifying their attacks and expanding their control over the countryside. The United States, having backed the coup, found itself increasingly isolated, its chosen ally gone, and its hopes for a stable and independent South Vietnam fading fast. The ghosts of Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat that had signaled the end of their colonial rule, haunted American policymakers. The spectre of another foreign power getting bogged down in a Vietnamese quagmire loomed large. Yet, despite the growing unease, the United States seemed unable to extricate itself from the quagmire that was Vietnam. Section 5. The Gulf of Tonkin Incident, August 1964. In the steamy heat of August 1964, an event occurred that would dramatically escalate the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. The USS Maddox, an American destroyer on patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. 2 days later, in the midst of a storm, the Maddox and another destroyer, the USS Turner Joy, reported another attack. The Johnson administration seized on these incidents, presenting them as unprovoked acts of aggression by North Vietnam. President Lyndon B. Johnson, thrust into the presidency just months earlier after Kennedy's assassination, addressed the nation, his voice grave as he spoke of the need to defend American interests and honor its commitments. Within days, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting Johnson broad authority to escalate military action in Vietnam. The resolution, passed with near-unanimous support, effectively gave Johnson a blank check to wage war in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, later revealed to be a case of mistaken intentions and possibly fabricated evidence, had profound consequences. It provided the pretext for the massive escalation of American involvement in Vietnam, transforming what had been a limited engagement into a full-blown war. Section 6, Escalation, a Nation Divided, 1965. Armed with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, President Johnson unleashed the might of the American military on Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder commenced in February 1965, marking a significant escalation of the war. In March, the first American combat troops landed in South Vietnam. The United States embarked on a strategy of attrition. As the war escalated, so too did opposition at home. The anti-war movement gained momentum. Section 7. The Air War Operation Rolling Thunder, 1965 to 1968. Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, was a cornerstone of the American war effort. From March 1965 to October 1968, American aircraft flew over 1 million sorties. The objective to cripple North Vietnam's war-making capacity and force Hanoi to negotiate. B-52 bombers unleashed massive payloads on strategic targets. Fighter bombers struck at enemy troop concentrations and supply depots. The air war, it was believed, would bring North Vietnam to its knees. However, the air war proved to be both costly and ineffective. Section 8, Search and Destroy, the Grueling Ground War, 1965 to 1967. While the air war raged above, a different kind of war was being fought on the ground in South Vietnam. American and South Vietnamese troops, often operating in small units, engaged in a grueling and dangerous game of cat and mouse with the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. The strategy: search and destroy. American troops, often relying on helicopters for mobility, would sweep through suspected enemy areas, searching for signs of Viet Cong activity. When they found them, they would engage the enemy, calling in artillery and air support to break their resistance. The ground war was a brutal and unforgiving affair. American soldiers, many of them young draftees, faced a determined and elusive enemy, fighting in a hostile environment where the jungle itself seemed to be their enemy. They endured stifling heat, torrential rains, and the constant threat of booby traps, ambushes, and sniper fire. Despite their technological superiority, American troops often found themselves outmaneuvered by the Viet Cong, who were masters of guerrilla warfare. The Viet Cong, fighting on their own terrain, knew how to use the jungle to their advantage, disappearing into tunnels, launching surprise attacks, and then melting away before American firepower could be brought to bear. Section 9. The Tet Offensive. A turning point, 1968. The Tet Offensive, launched by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army on January 30th, 1968, was a pivotal moment in the Vietnam War. It was a military defeat for the Communists, but a strategic victory that exposed the credibility gap in the American government's narrative of the war. On the eve of Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including Saigon, the capital. The attacks, though eventually repelled, shook the South Vietnamese government to its core and sent shockwaves through the American public. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the Communists, was a turning point in the war. It shattered the American public's belief that the war was winnable. The images of the fighting, broadcast on television screens across the nation, contradicted the Johnson administration's optimistic assessments of the war's progress. The Tet Offensive exposed the credibility gap, the chasm between the Johnson administration's optimistic pronouncements about the war and the grim reality on the ground. It eroded public support for the war and fueled the anti-war movement, which gained momentum and began to influence American politics. Section 10. The War Comes Home. Anti-war movement 1965 to 1968. As the Vietnam War escalated, so too did opposition at home. The war became deeply personal, dividing families, communities, and the nation. Fueled by moral outrage and fear, the anti-war movement emerged as a powerful force. College campuses became hotbeds of protest with teach-ins and demonstrations. Young men burned draft cards or fled to Canada to avoid military service. Musicians like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez captured the era's discontent. The media amplified the anti-war movement's voice, resonating with many Americans. The Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular as the conflict dragged on. The war divided families and sparked debates about its morality and American power. Section 1. The Spectre of Stalemate, 1969 to 1970. Richard Nixon inherited a war that had become America's nightmare. Elected on a promise to end the conflict, he faced the daunting task of extricating the United States from the quagmire of Vietnam while preserving American credibility on the world stage. But the war, far from winding down, had reached a bloody stalemate. The Tet Offensive, though a military defeat for the Communists, had shattered the illusion of American invincibility. The Viet Cong, though weakened, were far from defeated, and the North Vietnamese army, reinforced and resupplied by its communist allies, continued to pose a formidable threat. The American public, weary of the war's mounting casualties and dubious progress, grew increasingly disillusioned. Anti-war protests, once confined to college campuses, spread to cities and towns across the country, fueled by a growing sense that the war was unwinnable and perhaps even unjust. Nixon, a shrewd politician known for his pragmatism, recognized the need for a new strategy. He could not simply withdraw from Vietnam, not without risking a communist victory that would damage American prestige and embolden its Cold War adversaries. He needed a way to extricate the United States from the conflict while saving face and preserving its interests in the region. Section 2. Nixon's Gambit, Vietnamization and Détente, 1969 to 1972. Nixon's answer to the Vietnam dilemma was twofold: Vietnamization and détente. Vietnamization, as the name suggests, aimed to gradually withdraw American troops from Vietnam while simultaneously strengthening the South Vietnamese army to fight their own war. Under Vietnamization, American troops would increasingly take on a supporting role, providing air power, logistics, and training to their South Vietnamese counterparts. The goal was to create a South Vietnamese army capable of defending its own nation without relying on American combat troops. Détente, on the other hand, was a diplomatic initiative aimed at easing tensions with the Soviet Union and China, North Vietnam's communist allies. By opening a dialogue with these communist powers, Nixon hoped to reduce their support for North Vietnam and create a more favorable environment for a negotiated settlement. Nixon's strategy was a gamble, a delicate balancing act that sought to wind down American involvement in Vietnam, while simultaneously pursuing a more assertive foreign policy on the world stage. It was a strategy born of necessity, a recognition that the United States could not sustain its current level of involvement in Vietnam indefinitely, yet could not afford to simply cut and run. Section 3, The Secret War, Cambodia and Laos, 1969 to 1973. While pursuing Vietnamization and détente, Nixon also authorized a secret expansion of the war into neighboring Cambodia and Laos. These countries, officially neutral in the conflict, were used by North Vietnam as sanctuaries and supply routes for their troops and materials. In 1969, Nixon authorized the secret bombing of Cambodia, targeting suspected North Vietnamese bases and supply lines. This bombing campaign, kept secret from the American public and Congress, would continue for years, dropping more bombs on Cambodia than were used by the United States during World War II. In Laos, the United States supported a clandestine war against the Pathet Lao, the communist insurgency, providing arms, training and air support to Laotian government forces. This secret war, fought primarily by Hmong tribesmen allied with the United States, remained largely hidden from public view. The expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos had devastating consequences for these countries, destabilizing their governments, fueling internal conflicts, and leaving behind a legacy of unexploded ordnance that continues to claim lives to this day. It also further eroded public trust in the Nixon administration, which had repeatedly misled the American people about the true nature and extent of American involvement in Southeast Asia. Section 4, My Lie, A Massacre Uncovered, 1968. In March 1968, an event occurred that would shock the conscience of the world and forever stain America's image, the My Lai massacre. On that day, a company of American soldiers under the command of Lieutenant William Calley entered the village of My Lai, believing it to be a Viet Cong stronghold. What followed was a horrific act of barbarity. American soldiers, their minds warped by the horrors of war and fueled by a toxic mix of fear, anger, and racism, turned their guns on unarmed civilians. Over the course of several hours, they systematically murdered hundreds of Vietnamese men, women, and children. The My Lai massacre, initially covered up by the army, came to light a year later when Ron Ridenhour, a former soldier who had heard rumors of the incident, began a relentless campaign to expose the truth. His efforts led to a military investigation and eventually to the court-martial of Lieutenant Calley. The My Lai massacre shocked the world and sparked outrage and revulsion across the globe. It became a symbol of the dark side of the American war effort, a stark reminder of the moral compromises and the potential for barbarity that war can unleash. It further eroded support for the war in the United States and fueled the anti-war movement, which gained even greater moral authority. Section 5. The Pentagon Papers Secrets Revealed, 1971. In June 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from a top-secret study of the Vietnam War commissioned by the Pentagon. These documents, known as the Pentagon Papers, revealed a history of government deception and misleading statements about the war, dating back to the Truman administration. The Pentagon Papers revealed that successive administrations had misled the American public about the origins of the war, the reasons for American involvement, and the prospects for victory. The documents showed that the Johnson administration had systematically lied about the progress of the war, concealing evidence that contradicted its optimistic assessments. The publication of the Pentagon Papers, despite attempts by the Nixon administration to block their release, sent shockwaves through the American political establishment and further eroded public trust in the government. The documents confirmed what many Americans had come to suspect, that they had been lied to about the war. The Pentagon Papers fueled the anti-war movement, providing further ammunition for those who argued that the war was not only unwinnable, but also based on a foundation of lies. The revelations also had a chilling effect on the relationship between the government and the press, contributing to a climate of suspicion and distrust that would linger for decades. Section 6. A Nation Protests. The Moratorium to End the War, 1969 to 1971. As the Vietnam War dragged on, the anti-war movement in the United States gained momentum, evolving from a fringe element into a powerful political force. Protests, once confined to college campuses, spread to cities and towns across the country, drawing millions of Americans from all walks of life. One of the most significant anti-war protests was the Moratorium to End the War in Vietnam, a series of nationwide demonstrations that took place in 1969 and 1970. The moratorium brought together a diverse coalition of anti-war groups, including students, veterans, religious leaders, and ordinary citizens united in their opposition to the war. The moratorium demonstrations were largely peaceful, characterized by teach-ins, candlelight vigils, and marches on Washington. However, there were also instances of violence as frustrated and angry protesters clashed with police. The moratorium, despite its peaceful intentions, revealed the deep divisions that the war had created within American society. The moratorium to end the war in Vietnam was a testament to the power of protest and the growing opposition to the war within the United States. It demonstrated the ability of ordinary citizens to mobilize and make their voices heard, even in the face of government intransigence and a seemingly intractable conflict. The Paris Peace Accords of 1973 marked the end of American involvement in the Vietnam War. The accords called for a ceasefire, withdrawal of American troops, and release of prisoners of war. However, they allowed North Vietnam to keep its troops in the south, setting the stage for future conflict. Though hailed as a triumph, the accords proved to be a fragile peace. The fall of Saigon Endgame 1975. The Paris Peace Accords were a brief interlude in the Vietnam tragedy. The South Vietnamese army, plagued by corruption and low morale, struggled without American support. In spring 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a massive offensive. The South Vietnamese government was caught by surprise, its defenses crumbling. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks captured Saigon. The fall of Saigon was chaotic, with thousands fleeing in fear. It marked the end of an era for both Vietnam and the United States. Section 9. The Boat People Exodus from Vietnam 1975 to the 1980s. The fall of Saigon triggered a mass exodus of refugees from Vietnam, primarily from the south. Hundreds of thousands of people, fearing persecution from the new communist regime, braved perilous journeys by sea in overcrowded and often rickety boats, seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. These refugees, dubbed boat people, faced a harrowing ordeal. They endured storms, piracy, hunger, thirst, and disease, their boats often sinking or being attacked by pirates who preyed on their desperation. Many perished at sea, their dreams of freedom swallowed by the vastness of the ocean. Those who survived the journey faced an uncertain future. They languished in refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and other countries, often living in squalid conditions, their fate hanging in the balance as they waited for countries to offer them asylum. The plight of the Vietnamese boat people captured the world's attention, highlighting the human cost of the war and the enduring legacy of conflict. It also sparked a global humanitarian response, with many countries, including the United States, opening their doors to Vietnamese refugees, offering them a chance to rebuild their lives in a new land. Section 10. Scars of War Agent Orange and its Legacy. The Vietnam War left an enduring legacy of pain and suffering, not just in the form of physical wounds and psychological trauma, but also in the environmental devastation caused by the widespread use of Agent Orange, a powerful herbicide sprayed by the US military to defoliate jungles and destroy enemy crops. Agent Orange, named for the orange stripe on the barrels containing it, contained dioxin, a highly toxic chemical that has been linked to a wide range of health problems, including cancer, birth defects, and other serious illnesses. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and American veterans were exposed to Agent Orange during the war, with devastating consequences that continue to this day. In Vietnam, generations have been born with birth defects and health problems attributed to Agent Orange exposure. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates that up to 1 million people in Vietnam suffer from disabilities or health problems linked to Agent Orange. The legacy of Agent Orange remains a contentious issue both in Vietnam and in the United States. The US government, while acknowledging the health problems faced by American veterans exposed to Agent Orange, has been slow to accept responsibility for the environmental and human health consequences of its use in Vietnam. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American society, dividing the nation and eroding trust in government. It challenged America's self-image and exposed the limits of its power. The war divided Americans along generational, political, and ideological lines. It fueled social and cultural upheavals as young people embraced counterculture movements. The war eroded public trust in government and contributed to a decline in military support. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on the American psyche, shaping its foreign policy and domestic politics. For Vietnam, the war's end marked the beginning of a long and arduous journey toward recovery and reconciliation. The country lay in ruins, its economy shattered, its people deeply scarred by decades of conflict and division. The victorious communist government, under the leadership of the North Vietnamese, faced the daunting task of reunifying the country, rebuilding its infrastructure and healing the wounds of war. They implemented socialist economic policies, collectivizing agriculture and nationalizing industries with mixed results. Vietnam also faced international isolation in the aftermath of the war. The United States, embittered by its defeat and wary of the new communist government, imposed a trade embargo and diplomatic isolation on Vietnam. Despite these challenges, Vietnam has made remarkable progress in the decades since the war. It has shifted from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented system, attracting foreign investment and experiencing significant economic growth. Vietnam has also re-engaged with the international community, normalizing relations with the United States and joining regional and international organizations. The Vietnam War holds valuable lessons for humanity. It reminds us of the human cost of conflict and the moral complexities of war. It compels us to reflect on the limits of power and the need for diplomacy. The Vietnam War teaches us about the dangers of hubris and the importance of questioning authority. It also offers glimmers of hope and the resilience of the human spirit. We must honor the sacrifices and commit to learning from the past. Through American eyes, voices from the jungle. The Vietnam War was fought not only on battlefields but also within the hearts and minds of those who experienced its brutal reality firsthand. To truly understand the war's profound impact, we must listen to the voices of those who were there, the American soldiers who fought in a foreign land, and the Vietnamese civilians caught in the crossfire. For American soldiers, Vietnam was a crucible of fire, a trial by combat that tested their courage, their resilience, and their very humanity. They were young men, many of them draftees, thrust into a hostile and unforgiving environment, far from home and everything familiar. They faced a determined enemy, a relentless jungle, and the constant threat of death or injury. They witnessed unimaginable horrors, the brutality of combat, the loss of comrades, and the toll that war exacted on both the body and the soul. They grappled with the moral complexities of a conflict that seemed to defy easy answers, questioning their role in a war that often seemed senseless and unwinnable. Their stories are not tales of glory or conquest, but of survival, of camaraderie, and the enduring bonds forged in the crucible of combat. They are stories of fear, of loss, and of the enduring scars that war leaves on the human psyche. A Letter Home, John's Story, 1967. John, a young soldier from Iowa, sits hunched over a makeshift writing table in his sweltering tent, a flickering candle casting long shadows on the canvas walls. He's writing a letter home, trying to bridge the vast distance that separates him from his family and his former life. He writes of the stifling heat, the relentless mosquitoes, and the ever-present danger that permeates the air like the pungent aroma of napalm and gunpowder. He describes a recent firefight, the terror that gripped him as bullets whizzed past, the sickening thud of a mortar round, and the gut-wrenching sight of his best friend lying still on the battlefield. He tries to articulate the indescribable, the fear, the boredom, the camaraderie, and the gnawing guilt of surviving when so many others have not. But words fail him. How can he possibly convey the reality of war, the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the raw emotions that threaten to consume him? He seals the letter with a kiss, a tangible expression of love and longing for a world that seems impossibly distant. He entrusts the letter to the military postal system, a fragile link between the battlefields of Vietnam and the quiet normalcy of his hometown. He prays that his family will understand, that they will see beyond the words to the heart of a young man forever changed by war. The weight of memory, a veteran remembers decades have passed since the fall of Saigon, but the Vietnam War still casts a long shadow over the life of Michael, a veteran who served 2 tours in Vietnam. He sits in his quiet study, surrounded by books and mementos of a war that continues to haunt his dreams. He closes his eyes, and the memories come flooding back. The roar of helicopters, the smell of burning jungle, the faces of his comrades, some forever young, frozen in time. He remembers the thrill of combat, the adrenaline rush of a firefight, but also the guilt of surviving when so many others didn't. He carries the weight of those memories like a heavy pack on his back, a burden that he has carried for years, trying to make sense of the chaos, the violence, and the loss. He has struggled with PTSD, the nightmares, the flashbacks, the survivor's guilt. He seeks solace in the company of other veterans, men who share his experiences, who understand the language of war, the unspoken bonds forged in the crucible of combat. They gather at VFW halls, at reunions, at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., seeking comfort in shared memories and a nation's belated gratitude. Section 4, Vietnamese Voices, Life in the Crossfire. While American soldiers fought a war in a foreign land, the Vietnamese people endured a different kind of conflict, a war that invaded their homes, their villages, and their very lives. They were caught in the crossfire, victims of a war that pitted their nation against itself, a war that seemed to have no end. They witnessed the destruction of their homes, their villages, their livelihoods. They endured the loss of loved ones, the constant fear of bombs and bullets, and the uncertainty of living in a country torn apart by war. They struggled to survive, to protect their families, and to maintain their humanity in the face of unimaginable suffering. Their stories are not tales of strategy or ideology, but of resilience, of the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. They are stories of loss, of adaptation, and of the enduring hope for peace and reconciliation. They speak of the terror of living under constant threat, of fleeing their homes, of losing loved ones. They speak of the struggle to rebuild their lives, to heal the wounds of war, and to find forgiveness in a nation still grappling with the legacy of a conflict that touched every life. Section 5. The Girl in the Village, Lan's Story, 1972. Lan, a young girl living in a small village in the Mekong Delta, remembers the war as a time of fear and uncertainty. She remembers the roar of American bombers overhead, the thunderous explosions that shook the ground, and the constant fear of being caught in the crossfire. She remembers the day her village was bombed, the chaos and confusion as people ran for their lives, the screams of the wounded, and the sight of her home reduced to rubble. She remembers the fear that gripped her as she and her family fled into the jungle seeking refuge from the bombs and bullets. She remembers the kindness of strangers, the villagers who shared their meager food and shelter with her family, and the soldiers, both North and South Vietnamese, who sometimes offered them protection. She remembers the resilience of her people, their determination to survive, and their enduring hope for peace. Lan's story is not unique. It is the story of countless Vietnamese children who came of age during the war, their lives forever shaped by conflict and loss. Their stories are a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity for hope and resilience even in the darkest of times. Section 6. Scars that Remain, a Vietnamese grandmother speaks. Mai, now a grandmother, still bears the scars of war, both physical and emotional. She sits in her small garden, surrounded by lush greenery, a testament to her resilience and her people's ability to rebuild. She speaks of the war with a quiet dignity, her voice trembling slightly as she recalls the bombing of her village, the loss of her husband, and the years she spent struggling to raise her children alone in a country torn apart by conflict. She speaks of the fear that still lingers, the memories that still haunt her dreams. She speaks of the challenges of rebuilding her life, of the economic hardships, the social stigma, and the lingering health effects of Agent Orange exposure. She speaks of the importance of forgiveness, of reconciliation, and of the need to move forward to build a better future for her children and grandchildren. Her story, like those of countless other Vietnamese, is a reminder of the enduring human cost of war, the scars that remain long after the guns have fallen silent. It is a story of resilience, of the human spirit's capacity to endure and to hope, even in the face of unimaginable loss and suffering. Section 7, A Bridge of Understanding, American veteran meets Vietnamese farmer. Years after the war, an unexpected encounter takes place on a quiet stretch of land that was once a battlefield. Jim, an American veteran, returns to Vietnam, seeking closure and a chance to make peace with his past. He meets Tran, a Vietnamese farmer who lost his family and his livelihood during the war. They stand on opposite sides of a divide, former enemies brought together by fate and a shared desire for healing. Through a translator, they share their stories, their experiences of war, their losses, their hopes and their fears. They discover a shared humanity that transcends the barriers of language, culture and ideology. They part ways, not as former enemies, but as fellow travelers on the road to peace and reconciliation. Their encounter, a testament to the power of dialogue and understanding, offers a glimmer of hope that even the deepest wounds of war can be healed. Section 8. The Power of Music, Healing the Wounds of War. Music, a universal language that transcends borders and ideologies, played a powerful role in the Vietnam War and its aftermath. It served as a source of comfort and solace for soldiers on both sides, a rallying cry for protesters, and a catalyst for healing and reconciliation. During the war, American soldiers listened to rock and roll, soul, and folk music, finding solace in familiar sounds that reminded them of home and a world beyond the battlefield. Vietnamese soldiers and civilians, meanwhile, found comfort in traditional Vietnamese music, which provided a sense of continuity and cultural identity in a time of upheaval. In the aftermath of the war, music continued to play a vital role in healing the wounds of conflict. Vietnamese and American musicians began to collaborate, using music as a bridge of understanding and a way to build relationships across the divide created by war. Music, with its ability to evoke emotions, to bridge cultural divides, and to foster understanding, has played a vital role in the healing process, reminding us of our shared humanity and the possibility of peace and reconciliation. Section 9. The Legacy of Loss, Missing in Action. The Vietnam War continues to cast a long shadow over the families of those who never returned home. For them, the war did not end with the fall of Saigon. It continues to this day, a wound that refuses to heal. Thousands of American soldiers remain unaccounted for from the Vietnam War, their fate unknown, their families left to grapple with the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing what happened to their loved ones. The pain of their loss is compounded by the passage of time, the fading of memories, and the diminishing hope of ever finding answers. The families of those missing in action have dedicated their lives to keeping their memories alive, to seeking answers, and to ensuring that their sacrifices are not forgotten. They have formed support groups, lobbied the government for information, and traveled to Vietnam to search for answers. Their stories are a poignant reminder of the enduring human cost of war, the sacrifices made by those who served, and the enduring legacy of loss that extends across generations. They remind us that war's true cost is not measured only in casualties, but also in the shattered lives and the enduring pain of those left behind. Section 10. The Search for Peace, a Shared Humanity. The Vietnam War, for all its tragedy and loss, also offers a glimmer of hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit yearns for peace, for understanding, and for reconciliation. It reminds us that the barriers that divide us, whether based on ideology, nationality, or culture, are ultimately artificial, and that beneath the surface we share a common humanity. The search for peace is not a passive endeavor, but an active and ongoing process that requires courage, compassion, and a willingness to see beyond the wounds of the past. It requires dialogue, understanding, and a commitment to building bridges of trust and respect. The Vietnam War, for all its pain and loss, offers a powerful lesson for humanity, that war is not inevitable, that peace is always possible, and that the human spirit, though capable of great darkness, also possesses an enduring capacity for forgiveness, compassion, and love. As we move forward, let us carry with us the lessons of the Vietnam War, not with bitterness or regret, but with a renewed determination to build a world where peace is not just a dream, but a living reality. Section 1. The Home Front, a nation divided. The Vietnam War was not confined to the battlefields of Southeast Asia. It reached across the Pacific, casting a long shadow over American society, dividing families, igniting protests, and leaving an indelible mark on the nation's psyche. The home front, once a source of unwavering support for America's wars, became a battleground of its own, a crucible where the nation's values, its identity, and its very soul were tested. The war exposed deep fissures in American society, revealing a generation gap, a racial divide, and a growing chasm between the government and the governed. What began as a distant conflict, a Cold War obligation in a faraway land, morphed into a visceral, all-consuming national trauma. Support for the war, initially high, eroded steadily as the conflict dragged on, the casualty lists grew longer, and the images of carnage and destruction beamed into living rooms every night contradicted the government's optimistic pronouncements about progress and victory. The nation found itself increasingly polarized, divided between hawks who supported the war and doves who opposed it, between those who believed in America's moral obligation to fight communism and those who questioned the war's morality and its impact on both Vietnam and the United States. The youth anti-war movement, a generation in revolt defined by idealism and activism. They saw the Vietnam War as a moral outrage, a betrayal of American values. From college campuses to city streets, a youth-led anti-war movement emerged. They organized teach-ins, rallies and marches, challenging the legitimacy of the war. They were a generation in revolt, demanding peace and justice. Section 3, From Protest to Resistance. The draft and its discontents. Fueling the anti-war movement's fire was the ever-present spectre of the draft, a system that conscripted young men into military service, sending them to fight and die in a war they increasingly opposed. The draft became a symbol of the war's deep unpopularity, a visceral reminder of its personal cost. For many young men, the draft lottery, a random selection process that determined who would be called to serve, was a source of profound anxiety. It represented a loss of control over their own destinies, a cruel game of chance that could send them to a war they didn't believe in. Resistance to the draft took many forms. Some young men sought deferments or exemptions, enrolling in college, claiming conscientious objector status, or even fleeing to Canada. Others, driven by principle or desperation, resorted to more radical measures, burning their draft cards in acts of defiance or engaging in acts of civil disobedience. The draft resistance movement, though a minority within the larger anti-war movement, reflected the deep divisions that the war had created within American society. It highlighted the moral dilemmas faced by young men forced to choose between serving their country in a war they opposed or facing imprisonment and social stigma. Section 4, the media war images that shocked a nation. The Vietnam War was the first televised war, a conflict beamed directly into American living rooms with an immediacy and visceral impact that previous generations could scarcely imagine. The nightly news became a window into the horrors of war, bringing the sights, sounds and smells of combat into American homes with a raw, unfiltered intensity that shattered the government's carefully constructed narrative of a just and winnable war. Images of American soldiers mired in rice paddies, helicopters ferrying wounded and dead, and Vietnamese civilians fleeing burning villages became seared into the nation's collective memory. The war's brutality, once hidden from public view, was now impossible to ignore. The media's coverage of the war, while often criticized by the government and its supporters as biased and demoralizing, played a crucial role in shaping public opinion. The images and stories coming out of Vietnam challenged the government's optimistic pronouncements about progress and victory, revealing the true cost of the war and fueling the growing anti-war movement. The media's role in the Vietnam War was complex and controversial, but its impact on American society was undeniable. It brought the realities of war into American homes, forcing the nation to confront the human cost of its foreign policy and sparking a debate about the role of the media in a democracy. Section 5, the credibility gap, trust eroded. The Tet Offensive, a coordinated surprise attack during the Vietnamese New Year, shattered the illusion of American control over the war. The media's graphic coverage contradicted the Johnson administration's assurances that the war was being won. The credibility gap eroded public trust in the Johnson administration and marked a turning point in American public opinion. Section 6. The political fallout from LBJ to Nixon. Lyndon B. Johnson, who had escalated American involvement in Vietnam, saw his presidency shattered by the war's unpopularity. Facing mounting opposition, Johnson announced in March 1968 that he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon, promising to bring peace with honor, won the 1968 presidential election. Nixon inherited a war that would test his political skills and leave an indelible mark on his presidency. Section 7. A Nation's Conscience, the Moral Debate. The Vietnam War ignited a profound moral reckoning within American society, challenging the notion of American exceptionalism. The brutality of the war raised questions about the morality of American actions in Vietnam. The moral debate forced Americans to confront the limits of their values and the consequences of their actions. Section 8. The Legacy of Vietnam, a Reckoning with War. The Vietnam War left an indelible mark on the American psyche, shaping its foreign policy and domestic politics. It led to a deep-seated skepticism about foreign interventions and a demand for greater transparency and accountability from the government. The war inspired a generation of artists, writers, and filmmakers to grapple with its legacy. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, the term Vietnam Syndrome emerged to describe the nation's collective trauma. It reflected a fear of repeating the mistakes of Vietnam and a shift in American public opinion. The legacy of Vietnam Syndrome was a more cautious approach to foreign policy and a greater emphasis on diplomacy. Its impact on American foreign policy is still evident today. For many Vietnam veterans, the war did not end with the fall of Saigon. They returned home to a nation divided, their service often unappreciated, and their sacrifices misunderstood. Over time, veterans began to find their voice, demanding recognition and seeking treatment for their wounds. The Vietnam War revealed the enduring strength of the human spirit and the importance of healing. The helicopter blades churned the humid air, a haunting echo of a war long past. We journeyed through time, listening to the raw, unfiltered testimonies of those who witnessed the horrors of war. The Vietnam War continues to reverberate through time, its legacy shaping the political landscape and cultural discourse. Memory, a double-edged sword, both preserves and haunts. We had seen the tears of veterans and heard the stories of Vietnamese families torn apart by war. We witnessed the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity for resilience, and the hope for a future free from war. The Vietnam War was a transformative experience that shattered the nation's innocence and tested its resolve. It polarized American society, ignited an anti-war movement, and eroded public trust in the government. The war's legacy continues to shape American foreign policy and foster skepticism about military interventions. For Vietnam, the war was a national tragedy. But from the ashes of war, Vietnam has risen. Vietnam's journey from devastation to economic growth is a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people. Vietnam's story is a reminder that hope can take root, wounds can heal, and nations can rebuild. Section 5. The Unhealed Wounds. Decades after the war, the physical and psychological wounds linger, a constant reminder of the enduring cost of conflict. For many veterans, the war remains an unhealed wound, a source of recurring nightmares and PTSD. In Vietnam, the war's legacy is etched into the landscape and the generations born with birth defects attributed to Agent Orange exposure. Section 6. The Price of Freedom. The Vietnam War was fought in the name of freedom, a concept with different meanings for different people. The war reminds us that freedom is a multifaceted ideal with enduring costs. Section 7. Lessons Unlearned. The Vietnam War holds important lessons for policymakers, military leaders, and citizens alike. It underscores the need for transparency, accountability, and a foreign policy rooted in diplomacy and peace. Section 8. The Enduring Questions. The Vietnam War continues to spark debate, challenging us to confront the complexities of history and the enduring human cost of conflict. Section 9. A time for healing, a time for peace. The Vietnam War, for all its tragedy, offers a glimmer of hope. Veterans and civilians from both sides have embarked on journeys of healing and reconciliation. The war stands as a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the timeless message